You're listening to Long Listen, a space for deep dives into books that shape how we think, work, and live. No hype, no shortcuts. Just thoughtful analysis, honest reflection, and conversations about ideas that deserve more than a 5-minute summary. Everyone knows Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Even if you've never read it, you've felt its presence. You've seen the quotes on Instagram. Don't work for money. Make money work for you. Your house is not an asset. Schools don't teach you about money. For many people in their 20s, this book isn't just a book. It's a wake-up call. Sometimes it's the first moment they realize, wait, maybe the system I trusted isn't designed to make me free. And yet, here's the uncomfortable question no one really asks. If Rich Dad, Poor Dad is so powerful, why are most people who love this book still stuck in the same financial place? Same job. Same anxiety at the end of the month. Same feeling of running faster, but not getting anywhere. That's not an attack on the book. It's an invitation to look deeper. Because maybe the problem isn't that Rich Dad, Poor Dad is wrong. Maybe the problem is that we read it the wrong way, especially when we're young. When you're 20 or 25, this book hits you like a slap in the face. It tells you that safety is an illusion, that a stable job might be a trap, that working hard doesn't automatically make you rich. And for a young mind already tired, already skeptical, already afraid of falling behind, those ideas are intoxicating. Suddenly, you don't want a job. You want freedom. You don't want a salary. You want assets. You don't want to waste time. You want to escape the rat race as fast as possible. But here's the part that often gets skipped. Rich Dad, Poor Dad was never a step-by-step manual. It doesn't tell you what to do on Monday morning. It doesn't tell you how to survive when your income is low. It doesn't tell you how to build assets when you don't yet have leverage, skills, or capital. Instead, it gives you something far more dangerous if misunderstood. A new way of thinking without a map. And when young people take that mindset without context, without patience, without realism, it can quietly turn into frustration. Or worse, reckless decisions disguised as financial courage. Quitting too early, investing without understanding, chasing shortcuts, feeling like a failure because freedom didn't arrive fast enough. So today, this is not another episode telling you how life-changing this book is. You already know that story. This is a conversation about what Rich Dad, Poor Dad doesn't say, and what it actually means for people growing up in today's world, not in 1980s America. Because maybe the real lesson of Rich Dad, Poor Dad isn't don't get a job. Maybe it's this. Before money works for you, you must learn how to work with reality. And that's where the story really begins. At its core, Rich Dad, Poor Dad is not really a book about money. It is a book about how people think about money, and more importantly, how those thoughts silently shape their entire lives. Robert Kiyosaki structures the book around two father figures: his biological father, the poor dad, and his best friend's father, the rich dad. The contrast between them is simple but powerful. Poor Dad believes in formal education, job security, promotions, and steady paychecks. Rich Dad believes in financial education, entrepreneurship, ownership, and cash flow. One teaches safety, the other teaches freedom. From this contrast, Kiyosaki builds a worldview that challenges everything most young people are taught about success. One of the most repeated lessons in the book is that the rich don't work for money, money works for them. On the surface, this sounds provocative, almost arrogant. But what Kiyosaki is really criticizing is the emotional relationship people have with money. In his view, most people spend their lives trapped between fear and desire. Fear of not having enough money pushes them into jobs they dislike. Desire for comfort and status pushes them into debt. The paycheck temporarily relieves fear, but the cycle restarts every month. This loop, which he famously calls the rat race, is not about laziness or intelligence. It is about emotional conditioning. Schools teach people how to be good employees, but they do not teach people how to understand money, risk, or systems. This leads to Kiyosaki's most controversial concept, the definition of assets and liabilities. In Rich Dad, Poor Dad, an asset is anything that puts money into your pocket, while a liability is anything that takes money out. Using this definition, he argues that many things society calls assets, like a personal house or a car, are actually liabilities if they generate expenses instead of income. This idea has been criticized by economists and financial planners, but its psychological impact is undeniable. It forces readers to stop thinking emotionally about ownership and start thinking in terms of cash flow. Kiyosaki is less interested in what you own and more interested in what your possessions do to your future options. Another central theme of the book is financial education. Kiyosaki repeatedly emphasizes that intelligence alone does not make people wealthy. In fact, many highly educated professionals remain financially stressed because they lack basic financial literacy. In interviews and talk shows, he often repeats the same message. It's not how much money you make, it's how much you keep and how hard it works for you. He criticizes the idea that a high salary equals success, pointing out that taxes, inflation, and lifestyle inflation quietly erode income. According to Kiyosaki, the real skill is learning how to acquire income-generating assets, whether through businesses, real estate, or investments, and then reinvesting the cash flow instead of consuming it. Outside the book, Kiyosaki's talk show appearances reveal an even sharper edge to his philosophy. He frequently speaks about the importance of understanding systems rather than following rules. He argues that governments, schools, and corporations are not designed to make individuals wealthy, but to keep systems running. This is why, in his view, obedience and compliance are rewarded more than creativity or financial independence. He also openly embraces failure as part of learning, often saying that his rich dad encouraged him to fail early and fail often, because mistakes are where real financial education happens. This perspective contrasts strongly with traditional schooling, where failure is punished and risk is discouraged. Kiyosaki also talks extensively about fear. In interviews, he explains that fear of losing money is the biggest obstacle to financial growth. Most people would rather feel safe than free, even if that safety is fragile. He does not deny that investing and entrepreneurship involve risk. Instead, he argues that avoiding risk entirely is itself the biggest risk. However, he often emphasizes that risk should be managed through education, not blind courage. This nuance is sometimes lost when his ideas are simplified into motivational quotes. Another recurring point in his public talks is the idea that time is more valuable than money. Kiyosaki argues that a job trades time for money, while assets separate income from time. This distinction is particularly attractive to young audiences who feel trapped by long working hours and uncertain futures. Yet, Kiyosaki also admits that building assets requires discipline, delayed gratification, and years of learning. In other words, freedom is not instant. It is built slowly, often while working within the very system one hopes to escape. When you combine the book with Kiyosaki's broader public commentary, a clearer picture emerges. Rich Dad, Poor Dad is not telling young people to quit their jobs, ignore education, or chase quick wealth. It is challenging them to question assumptions. Why do we equate security with success? Why do we avoid talking about money openly? Why do we spend years mastering professions but never learn how money flows through our lives? The book offers a mindset shift, not a roadmap. And that distinction matters more than most readers realize. Understanding Rich Dad. Poor Dad This Way changes its role entirely. It stops being a promise of wealth and becomes a lens through which to view work, money, and personal freedom. Whether that lens leads to clarity or confusion depends not on the book itself, but on how consciously the reader engages with it. One of the most seductive ideas people take from Rich Dad, Poor Dad is that investing is the escape hatch. Once you understand assets, once you stop trading time for money, everything will somehow fall into place. But what the book talks about far less, and what many creators almost never emphasize, is how emotionally violent real investing can be, especially for people who are just starting out. In theory, assets create freedom. In practice, assets fluctuate, collapse, freeze, and sometimes disappear entirely. Take the stock market, the most familiar asset class for people in the UK and the US. For decades, stocks have been marketed as the rational, grown-up way to build wealth. Put money into an index fund, stay patient, trust the system, and over very long periods, this logic often holds. But the journey is rarely smooth. In 2008, during the global financial crisis, the S&P 500 lost more than half its value. Retirement accounts in the US were cut in two. In the UK, the FTSE 100 dropped sharply as banks collapsed and housing markets froze. For millions of ordinary people, this was not an abstract chart on a screen. It was their savings, their pensions, their sense of security evaporating almost overnight. Fast forward to 2020. The COVID crash erased years of gains in a matter of weeks. Markets recovered, yes, but that recovery only benefited those who could afford to stay invested. Young people who had just started investing, often encouraged by social media and commission-free trading apps, watched their portfolios plunge before they had even learned how to emotionally handle volatility. Many sold at the bottom, locking in losses, not because they were foolish, but because no one had prepared them for the psychological cost of watching money disappear. Gold, often described as the safe asset, tells a similar story. In theory, gold protects against inflation and uncertainty. In reality, it goes through long periods of stagnation. Someone in the UK who bought gold near its peak in 2011 waited nearly a decade just to break even. In the US, gold surged during crises, only to fall back once fear subsided. For young investors who believed gold was a guaranteed hedge, this waiting game felt like failure. The asset didn't collapse, but it didn't deliver the freedom they imagined either. Time, opportunity cost, and patience became hidden expenses. Then there is Bitcoin, perhaps the most emotionally charged asset of the last decade. For many young people in the US and UK, Bitcoin felt like the ultimate rich dad asset. Decentralized, anti-system, independent of governments and banks. Early adopters became legends. Stories of people turning a few $1,000s into millions flooded YouTube and TikTok. What those stories rarely show is the volatility that destroys unprepared minds. Bitcoin has lost more than 70% of its value multiple times. In 2018, in 2022, and in several sharp crashes in between, entire waves of retail investors entered near the top and exited near the bottom. In the UK, young professionals used savings meant for house deposits to buy crypto during the 2021 bull market. In the US, college students took out personal loans or used credit cards, convinced they were investing rather than gambling. When prices collapsed, the financial loss was painful, but the psychological damage was worse. Shame, self-doubt, distrust in investing itself. None of this is mentioned when people casually quote, "Money works for the rich." What connects these examples is not bad assets or evil markets. It is misaligned expectations. Rich Dad, Poor Dad encourages people to step outside the comfort of salaries and savings accounts, but it does not fully prepare them for the emotional instability of living in a world where income and net worth are no longer predictable. Volatility is not just a financial concept, it is a mental state. Kiyosaki often says in interviews that risk is not knowing what you're doing. That sentence sounds simple, almost reassuring, but knowing what you're doing takes time, losses, and mistakes. Most young people don't lack courage, they lack context. They hear about financial freedom without hearing about drawdowns. They hear about passive income without hearing about years of negative returns. They hear about assets without hearing about illiquidity, leverage, and timing. In the UK, property is often framed as the ultimate asset, echoing many of Kiyosaki's ideas. But rising interest rates have shown how quickly this narrative can turn. Mortgage payments doubled for some homeowners. Buy-to-let investors saw profits vanish as borrowing costs rose and regulations tightened. In the U.S., adjustable-rate mortgages and over-leveraged real estate investors faced similar pressure. Real estate didn't stop being an asset. It simply reminded people that leverage cuts both ways. The uncomfortable truth is that assets demand emotional maturity. A salary hides volatility, assets expose it. When you rely on a job, the system absorbs some of the shocks for you. When you rely on investments, you absorb them yourself. This is rarely discussed in motivational content because fear doesn't sell as well as freedom. For young people raised in an era of instant feedback, fast content, and viral success stories, this gap is dangerous. Watching your portfolio drop 30% while everyone online pretends confidence is not empowering. It is isolating. Many quietly abandon investing altogether, concluding that the entire idea of financial independence was a lie. Others double down recklessly, chasing losses under the illusion of bravery. None of this means Rich Dad, Poor Dad is wrong about assets. It means assets are not neutral tools. They amplify who you already are. If you lack patience, they punish impatience. If you lack discipline, they magnify mistakes. If you lack emotional control, they turn normal market cycles into personal crises. In his talks, Kiyosaki often emphasizes that the real asset is not stocks, gold, or crypto, but financial intelligence. Yet this line is often treated as a slogan rather than a warning. Financial intelligence includes understanding that markets move in cycles, that losses are inevitable, and that freedom is built through resilience, not just returns. For a young person in London or New York, Manchester or Chicago, the question is not whether to invest. The question is whether they are psychologically prepared to live in a world where progress is invisible for long periods and setbacks are public and painful. The irony is that the very mindset Rich Dad, Poor Dad tries to cultivate, independence, responsibility, self-awareness, is the same mindset required to survive real investing. Without it, assets do not create freedom. They create stress. And this is the part of the story that rarely gets told. If Rich Dad, Poor Dad were written today, it would probably sound very different. Not because its core ideas are outdated, but because the terrain has changed. The economy young people are stepping into now is more fragmented, more digital, and more psychologically demanding than the one Kiyosaki was responding to decades ago. The promise of lifelong employment has eroded. Asset prices are higher relative to income. Information is abundant, but clarity is rare. In this environment, repeating old formulas without adaptation is not wisdom. It is nostalgia. A more useful starting point today is to rethink what an asset actually means for someone in their 20s or early 30s. Traditional assets like property, large stock portfolios, or capital-intensive businesses often require resources young people simply do not have yet. This does not mean they are excluded from wealth building. It means the first assets must look different. In the current landscape, skills that compound over time have become one of the most powerful and accessible forms of capital. Technical literacy, communication ability, data fluency, and creative problem solving are not soft ideas. They are income-generating engines. Unlike physical assets, they can be built with time rather than money, and they travel with you across industries and geographies. Alongside skills, personal leverage has become a central concept. In earlier decades, leverage meant borrowing money. Today, leverage also comes from media, networks, and platforms. A young person who can write clearly, explain complex ideas, or build an audience around a niche interest has access to opportunities that simply did not exist before. Content, code, and community are modern forms of leverage. They may not look like assets on a balance sheet, but they create optionality. And optionality is the real currency of freedom in uncertain times. Another shift in thinking involves the role of stability. Much financial advice frames stability and risk as opposites. In reality, they can be layered. Instead of abandoning traditional employment in pursuit of total independence, a more resilient approach is to use stability strategically. A job can fund learning, experimentation, and small bets. It can absorb volatility while other systems are built in parallel. Freedom is not about rejecting the system outright, but about not being trapped by it. Financial education today also needs to expand beyond investing mechanics. Understanding how markets work is important, but understanding how incentives shape behavior is critical. Algorithms influence what we see, consumer culture pushes constant spending, and social comparison distorts our sense of progress. In this environment, managing attention becomes as important as managing money. The ability to delay gratification, filter noise, and make decisions based on long-term values is a competitive advantage. These are not motivational cliches. They are survival skills in an economy designed to monetize distraction. Risk, too, needs to be redefined. For many young people, the biggest risk is not losing money in the market. It is committing too early to a narrow identity. Choosing a single path and clinging to it out of fear can be more dangerous than experimenting with multiple directions. A modern interpretation of financial intelligence includes career optionality, continuous learning, and the willingness to pivot. The goal is not to avoid failure, but to fail in ways that teach and do not permanently damage future choices. Technology has also changed the nature of ownership. Digital products, intellectual property, and online services allow individuals to build scalable value with minimal upfront cost. A small software tool, an educational product, or a specialized service can generate income without the heavy infrastructure traditionally associated with businesses. These paths are not easy, but they are more accessible than ever. They reflect a shift from asset accumulation to value creation, from passive income fantasies to active system building. Crucially, the timeline must be reframed. Much of the frustration around rich dad, poor dad comes from unrealistic expectations about speed. Social media compresses time, making years of progress look like overnight success. In reality, most sustainable financial growth happens quietly, unevenly, and without applause. A healthier model treats the 20s as a period of foundation building rather than outcome maximizing. Learning how to learn, building, resilience, and understanding personal strengths are investments whose returns may not show up immediately, but compound dramatically over decades. What emerges from this updated perspective is not a rejection of Kiyosaki's ideas, but an evolution of them. The core principle remains: do not outsource your financial future to systems that do not prioritize you. But the methods must fit the present. Financial freedom today is less about escaping work and more about designing work that aligns with autonomy, meaning, and adaptability. Ultimately, the new path is not defined by specific assets or strategies. It is defined by mindset, literacy, and flexibility. In a world where change is constant, the most valuable asset is the ability to respond intelligently rather than react emotionally. That ability cannot be bought. It must be cultivated. And perhaps that is the lesson that resonates most strongly now. Wealth is not just something you accumulate, it is something you grow into. So where does this leave Rich Dad, Poor Dad? And where does it leave us? Maybe the book was never meant to be a destination. Maybe it was meant to be a disruption. A moment that shakes you awake and forces you to question the rules you inherited without realizing it. In that sense, its greatest value is not in the answers it gives, but in the questions it provokes. Why do we work the way we do? Why does money feel so stressful? Why are we taught how to earn, but not how to think? The danger begins when we treat those questions as conclusions. When we turn mindset into ideology and freedom into a race. Financial independence is not a shortcut out of reality. It is a long negotiation. One that requires patience, emotional control, and the humility to admit that no book, no matter how influential, can replace lived experience. The core lesson, then, is simple but uncomfortable. Money amplifies who you already are. Assets do not rescue you from confusion. They demand clarity. They do not remove fear. They expose it. And freedom does not arrive the moment you stop working for a salary. It begins the moment you take responsibility for understanding how your choices compound over time. If Rich Dad, Poor Dad helped you see money differently, that's a win. But the next step is harder. It's learning how to translate ideas into decisions that fit your reality, your temperament, and your stage of life. This conversation doesn't end here. In fact, it shouldn't. I'm curious. When you first encountered Rich Dad, Poor Dad, what did it change for you? And what didn't it prepare you for? Did it inspire you, confuse you, or both? Share your thoughts in the comments.